So I've mentioned to you guys that I'm a bit of an amateur collector. I go to different secondhand shops and, used bookstores and stuff, and I look for historical pieces, right? Because this is my thing. White people today will tell a completely different story than they told 100 or 200 years ago. For example, you'll see white people today say things like the Civil War was not about slavery, it was about states' rights, okay? So I don't even bother to argue with them. I just go to my secondhand stores and I find a first-hand account from a white person living during the Civil War and see what they said about the disagreement, right? So I go to these places and I look for just historical things to dig around and find out some truths. And I found something interesting today. Today, I'm going to be discussing two different records that are recordings of an array of songs performed by a group of Chads called the Dukes of Dixieland, okay? Now, the reason that these Dukes of Dixieland records immediately stuck out to me is because of the word Dixieland. Now, this is not a word that I've ever heard like in real life conversation. That may be because I'm black. That may be because I'm a northerner. That may be because I'm black and a northerner. Maybe white people still use this term. Maybe southerners still use this term. I don't know. Y'all let me know, right? But I know this term because years ago, back when I was 12 years old, yes, 12, I'm not capping, okay? I read the book Going with the Wind and I became obsessed with it, okay? Like, and mind y'all, I was a kid, so I didn't understand, the fact that it was whitewashing slavery and stuff. I just saw a love story between Scarlett and Rhett, and I was, obsessed, right? I tell y'all, I thought Clark Gable was so fine. Like, I was in love with him back when I was 12, okay? And I was so obsessed with this book that I went doing all this digging and research. You know how you watch a show or read a book and you just get totally obsessed with it? Is that just me? I don't know. But when I'm really into something, I look up the actors, I look up the soundtrack, if it has good music and stuff, everything, right? So in this obsession, I stumbled across I think what it was in Going with the Wind, the movie, there's a scene, and I don't remember because I haven't watched the movie or read the book in a while. There's a scene where I think it might be the scene where they're reading off the names of people who had died in the war, because I remember, I think Melanie and Scarlett were listening to hear Ashley's name, because Scarlett Missy ass was in love with him. And I think one of the Tarleton twins' name was called or something, right? I think it was that scene, but I could be wrong. And a little boy is in the Confederate band, and they start playing a song, and the little boy is crying. So clearly somebody he cared about died, right? But they start playing this song, and I like the song, right? It's like right? So I went searching for that song. I think that's what got me on the track of that song. And I learned that it was called I Wish I Was in Dixieland. And that was actually the unofficial national anthem of the Confederate States of America, okay? It's crazy how white people can turn something as beautiful as music bad. But I'm going to get into that. I'm going to get into that in a second, y'all. So that's where I learned this term Dixie and Dixieland. And that's why these records immediately stuck out to me. So I want to read some of the stuff that's on the back of these records, because on the back of these records, they'll have biographies of the group and whatever, right? And I saw some interesting stuff. So first, I'm going to start reading the back of the first album that is called You Have to Hear It to Believe It, The Dukes of Dixieland. And I'll put a picture of the album next to me in the video so you guys can see it. As old Dan Emmett might have put it, just mix equal parts of contagious gusto, brashness, and natural feeling, and you're almost sure to catch the true spirit of minstrelsy. First of all, what they mean minstrelsy? They mean minstrel shows or whatever, Then add to this mixture the Dukes of Dixieland, and you have one of the most breathtaking, 100% pure and irresistible examples of musical spontaneous combustion in modern times. Daniel Decatur Emmett would probably have agreed, for he was the author of Dixie's Land, a song first performed in public in 1859 and the forerunner of the style of jazz that has come to be known as Dixieland. Dixieland was a name first used by some Negro slaves who were sent to Charleston, South Carolina by their owner, one Jonathan Dixie. It was their way of describing their owner's farm on Manhattan Island. When Daniel Emmett got the idea of writing a song with this title, he hadn't the faintest intention of writing a war anthem. Nevertheless, Dixie's Land years later became a sad reminder of the Confederate Army, and for Northerners it evoked thoughts of distant times and places, the longest trip away from home many had ever made. Now, the back of this record says way more stuff, but it's not about African Americans, so I don't care about it, right? There's 3 things I want to discuss from what I read. First of all, they said Dixie's Land years later became a sad reminder of the Confederate Army. So they think of the Confederate Army and the fact that it no longer exists, and they're sad about that. What does that say about them first and foremost, right? Now, the second thing is that I thought it was really interesting that this term Dixie's Land was actually coined by Negro slaves. Like, wow, it's crazy how literally everything in this country, even the stuff you think is white people's stuff, like Dixieland, for example, everything in this country comes back to us. Like, wow, that is insane. Like, what do y'all have without things that we invented? Nothing. Now, the third thing I want to discuss is actually going to bring us into the second album. It's the fact that they claim that this song, Dixie's Land, was a forerunner for the style of jazz that has come to be known as Dixieland. So they claim that this style of jazz that is found in Dixieland music comes from the Confederate national anthem that was written by a white man. So they acknowledge that the term Dixieland itself, that was the title of this national anthem, came from Negro slaves, but they claim that the jazz style that is used in Dixieland music came from this white guy, right? Now, mind you, this is the Dukes of Dixieland. You have to hear it to believe it, Volume 1. I believe this came out in 1952. Then we're going to look at the Dukes of Dixieland. You have to hear it to believe it, Volume 2, that I believe came out in 1957, because the math just not quite mathing, y'all. Now, Volume 2 says, if the test of greatness lies in taking the best elements of style and content, synthesizing them, and creating an individual mode of expression, the Dukes of Dixieland have certainly met this test. Looking back over the development of Dixieland, one finds dozens of forces which contributed to molding this style. In spite of the fact that the term original jazz was used for many years to describe that species of jazz which existed in New Orleans around the turn of the 20th century, there was really little that could be described as original and popular music of that time. The fact is that the early New Orleans music drew on many sources, African and European among others. With all due respect to the influence exerted on New Orleans music by the blues, any examination of early Negro American jazz and New Orleans music reveals that they had more differences than similarities, and the chief reason for this was that changes in environment produced marked changes in the various forms of expression. As they became assimilated in the environment of the New World, Negroes of African origin came to prefer musical instruments developed by the whites to the primitive instruments of their ancestors. But they did not confine themselves alone to borrowing new instruments. They also borrowed musical materials, including a wide variety of song and dance forms. It was only natural for Negroes who themselves or whose ancestors contented themselves with incantations and ritualistic dances to broaden their musical horizon by participating in and enjoying military marches, polkas, quadrilles, and other forms influenced by Western culture. By the same token, it is only natural that since the beginning of the 20th century, jazz performers have been influenced by the many forms of popular music which have evolved, including blues, ragtime, Dixieland, swing, bop, bebop, rebop, cool jazz, and progressive jazz. Environment has indeed proved to be a powerful influence, a process of borrowing from existing cultural forces in order to evolve. So the first record claims that that song Dixieland that was written by a white composer was like the forerunner, like the basis for the style of jazz that would come to be known as Dixieland, right? But then the second record claims that there were dozens and dozens of influences, yada, 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 so and so and so. Doesn't that seem like two completely contradicting stories? The next thing I want to comment on is this statement. As they became assimilated in the environment of the New World, Negroes of African origin came to prefer musical instruments developed by the whites to the primitive instruments of their ancestors. Now, this was particularly funny to me because As soon as I read this, I thought of the Stoner Rebellion, okay? So the Stoner Rebellion was a rebellion in which we used drums to signal what was going on. So I don't know what pattern we were drumming or whatever, but it was some clear signal that we are rebelling, right? After the Stoner Rebellion, white people were so terrified that they literally made it illegal for us to use African drums. White people made it illegal for us to use the instruments that we brought from Africa, but then they turned around and said that we came to prefer musical instruments developed by the whites to the primitive instruments of our ancestors. What? So we brought these instruments from Africa. White people literally made it illegal for us to use them. You can look up the Stoner Rebellion and see for yourself. Yes, white people outlawed the usage of African drums after the Stoner Rebellion, right? So then when we were forced to use white instruments because it was illegal for us to use our own, white people pushed this narrative that we were like, oh my gosh, like our instruments are primitive. We'd rather use the white people's instruments. Do you see how these people just rewrite history? And this is why they don't want to teach critical race theory. What the heck is critical race theory? It's literally just history, like history as it happened. But this is why they don't want to teach it, because once you have a bare understanding of history, this stuff sticks out to you and doesn't even make sense. Now, somebody who didn't know about the Stoner Rebellion probably read this and thought like, oh yeah, well, yeah, African Americans don't use their instruments, so they must have thought that. That's why they don't want to teach CRT. Like, y'all, when you go down to New Orleans, was that New Orleans? Yeah, it was New Orleans. There's a place called the Congo Square, right? And that's literally where African Americans used to go to sing and African dance and whatever, right? So you telling me that they took every chance they had to go participate in their actual culture, and you made it illegal for them to do that, but then you gonna turn around and say that we chose not to, like, what? But again, you see how white people just be rewriting history. They just be saying whatever because they're the ones writing the history books. They could just make up whatever they want to make up. Then the last thing I want to point out on this record, which is going to bring us to the third record actually, because I realized I have something else to talk about, is this statement: it was only natural for Negroes who themselves or whose ancestors contented themselves with incantations and ritualistic dances to broaden their musical horizon by participating in and enjoying military marches, polkas, quadrilles, and other forms influenced by Western culture. So they literally said that we participated in primitive, ritualistic, whatever, and it was only natural for us to see, white people's way of singing and dancing and be like, oh, let me participate in that, right? But hold up, this brings us to the next record. This is another Dukes of Dixieland record. This, in fact, is volume 6. So we went over volumes 1 and 2. Now we're going to take a look at volume 6, right? So this one is Mardi Gras Time with the Dukes of Dixieland. Now, I want to read something from the back of this one. It was the Negro who originated and developed New Orleans jazz, which stems from spirituals, work songs, minstrel songs, marches, Creole songs, music, and rhythms that were transported from Africa. They also incorporated into New Orleans jazz portions of the vast body of classical and folk music that the New World inherited from Europe. Very closely related to New Orleans jazz is Dixieland, a kind of music developed by white musicians in the Louisiana capital, which is almost as old as New Orleans jazz. The term Dixieland is often used in a broad sense to describe not only the latter kind of music, but also types of hot jazz developed subsequently by white musicians in other parts of the United States and patterned after New Orleans jazz. Most New Orleans and Dixieland jazz experts hold that the trend in chronological development was from New Orleans jazz to Dixieland. They based this contention on the fact that there were more Negro than white jazz musicians in New Orleans during the last decade of the 1890s and the first decade of the 1900s. Early 20th century white jazz in New Orleans was usually played with the same instruments employed in music performed by Negro musicians. Tunes were commonly exchanged, with the result that it is virtually impossible to try to determine who originated pieces. There is much evidence to show that many tunes were played for years before they were copyrighted, published, and circulated widely in printed form. Many of these tunes, or parts of them, had their roots in folk music of the American Negro. At the same time, Negro musicians during this period in New Orleans used a good deal of white folk music and popular music in their playing. So, recall, Volume 2 stated that The fact is that early New Orleans music drew on many sources, African and European among others. With all due respect to the influence exerted on New Orleans music by the blues, any examination of early Negro American jazz and New Orleans music reveals that they had more differences than similarities, right? So on volume 2, they're trying to make it seem like, yeah, okay, African Americans had some role in this, but there was also a huge white influence. And as a matter of fact, that early New Orleans music, that was the African American version, it had more differences than similarities with this Dixieland music that white people play, right? So it's more, it's more different than it is similar, right? But then in volume 6, they go and directly contradict themselves. So volume 2 is talking about how Negroes borrowed white instruments and folk songs and all of this stuff, yada, 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 enjoying military marches and polkas and so and so and so. To volume 6, literally being like, yeah, it's pretty much all from the Negro jazz, which stems from spirituals, work songs, yada, yada, yada. Y'all. Then volume 6 goes on to state, very closely related to New Orleans jazz is Dixieland, right? So it literally states, New Orleans jazz stems from spirituals, work songs, minstrel songs, marches, Creole songs, music, and rhythms that were transported from Africa. And then it literally says that the New Orleans jazz is very closely related to the Dixieland, which was developed, aka stolen, by white musicians in Louisiana. While volume 2 literally said that that Negro American jazz and New Orleans music, the Dixieland, whatever, had more differences than similarities. Like, do y'all see this, bro? Can you believe that the narrative went from, jazz was rooted in this song Dixieland that was composed by a white composer that was like the forerunner of jazz, to them saying, okay, well, maybe you had a little bit of African American influence, but they preferred, the European instruments to their primitive ones, so and so and so, to finally, okay, yeah, it's pretty much just African American. Like, and it's crazy because, like, what caused this change in the narrative? Because we all know white people ain't just have a change of heart and be like, you know what, let me do right and tell the truth. We all know. You can only imagine the outrage that African Americans must have displayed at this. Imagine, y'all. Imagine you do your homework and somebody copies off you, and then they say that you copied off them and you really dumb and you think that they're smarter than you and that's why you copy. And you like, what? Because the whole time you copied off me. Like, huh? The funniest thing about this is that these are all Dukes of Dixieland records. It's not like I got records made by 3 different groups. It was like, okay, look at how this one group tried to spin the narrative versus what this other group said. That would be a good enough point to make. Okay, look at how some people are painting this narrative or whatever, right? While others are telling the truth. That would be a good enough point. But no, this is all the same group. Like, do you see like the huge change in the narrative that they were pushing out? And you know good and well that they were not like, okay, let's do right. Let's do better and tell the truth about what happened. You know good and goddamn well that is not what happened. They must have been forced to tell the truth for whatever reason, because it ain't no way that they would turn around and be like, okay, yeah, all of this music came from African Americans, unless it was true. Why would they turn around and tell that lie? Like, that doesn't make sense. If it was made by white people, why would they lie and say that it's not? When they're the white people, like, come on now. I want to share one last thing from a 4th Dukes of Dixieland album. Y'all, I literally have like their entire repertoire at this point. I bought a bunch today and I've bought a bunch before. Like, I probably have every record by them and they lying asses. But I want to read something from this record. Since they received their training and early professional experience in an environment where so many different ethnic and musical forces had prevailed for nearly a century, the Dukes were well exposed to these forces. They absorbed the best features of Afro-American characteristics. They assimilated everything they could find in the Crescent City's musical heritage: European dance forms, songs, and marches, indigenous American material like work songs, ballads, blues, rags, spirituals, hollers, minstrel music, early popular songs, and New Orleans jazz as it was played by top jazzmen during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. They studied the work of leading personalities like Joseph King Oliver, William Bunk Johnson, Charles Buddy Bolden, William Buster Bailey, Meade Lux Lewis, Louis Armstrong, and scores of other greats, right? So on this album, And I don't know when this one was released as opposed to the other ones, but I'm assuming a couple years after. They go and they acknowledge that they studied the works of African American jazz musicians, right? So they knew this before they released their first albums, talking about, oh yeah, the music that we're playing has its roots in that song Dixieland. It was written by a white composer, and you know, the Negroes, they preferred European instruments over their primitive instruments, yada yada yada. They knew that they studied us before they spun that false narrative, yet they did anyway.